Consider supporting this podcast on Patreon. On this episode of the What is Asia podcast, I interview Miriam Stark, a professor of anthropology and the director for the Center of Southeast Asian Studies at the University of Hawai'i, to talk about archaeology in Cambodia, as well as ways that archaeologists can innovatively reach out to general audiences. Dr. Stark, thanks for coming on this episode of the What is Asia podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So you're the first person that we've had on the show who studies Cambodia. Can you start by giving a cursory overview of the geography of Cambodia, some of the features that define Cambodia, and then talk a little bit about the relationship between Cambodia and your research?
Cambodia is part of Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia is wedged south of China, and it is east of India and the Indian subcontinent. So people used to call the area Indochina. Southeast Asia has Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, Philippines, Indonesia, many countries. And Cambodia is part of mainland Southeast Asia. So it's just flanking the South China Sea. It's a very small country. It's one of the two smallest countries in mainland Southeast Asia, but it had an outsized impact during the pre-modern period. And that, of course, is why I study it. So the features that define Cambodia today are the reasons it had that impact. It is mostly flat, except for a few mountainous areas in its southeast, really in its it's southwest and its northeast. But most of it is this giant alluvial plain. That's a very good thing if you want to grow rice. So this whole area, which is part of the lower Mekong Basin, had a phenomenal capacity for rice production. And it is this Mekong plain that was this crucible for one of the region's earliest, most complex societies. And we usually gloss the name of that society as Angkor, from the 9th to 14th centuries. When I started working there, on an earlier time period and in a capacity building project, but it is the case that for the last 11 years, I've been working on Angkorian period.
Can you talk a little bit about how your research fits into this larger story of the archaeology and the history of Cambodia?
In a very geopolitical way, my research began as part of a grant to the East-West Center to engage in capacity building and research in Indochina. And so for Cambodia, we were asked by the Royal University of Fine Arts if we'd develop an archaeology project that both did research and trained the next generation of archaeologists. Cambodia went through a very rough period of civil war, which culminated really in the Khmer Rouge in the late 1970s, and most educated people either left or died. So by the time that Cambodia came out of the Vietnamese occupation, in the late 80s, there were very few archaeologists who were equipped to teach students or do research on the prehistory of their country. So that's where it started. And I was interested in working in Cambodia because it was this blank slate in mainland Southeast Asia. Plenty of Vietnamese archaeologists had been working for decades, including during what we call the Vietnam War. Thailand had gotten a lot of archaeological attention. And then here was Cambodia, where we knew it was the seat of this later civilization, Angkor, and we knew almost nothing about it because of decades of geopolitical conflict. So it was a very interesting place to work from an archaeological point of view, and it was a very urgent place to be doing training and teaching. So my work in Cambodia since 1996 has always blended teaching with research.
So often when people hear Angkor, they tend to think of Angkor Wat. Can you talk a little bit about this period and sort of just familiarize people with this historical time period?
I can try. For people who are more familiar with Europe, we would think of it as the medieval period. It's sort of the 9th through 14th or 15th centuries. What was very unusual about Angkor and about Cambodia at that time is that we see the development not only of these kingdoms that the Chinese described, but also of phenomenal monumental architecture, which would have required labor from tens of thousands of people to construct. So at the same time as maybe you see Chartres being built in France, you have these Angkorian monuments. And we tend to say Angkor Wat, but in fact, in the Angkor Archaeological Park, which is a World Heritage Site now, there are 1,200 different built structures. Of those 1,200 built structures, there are probably around 10 major state temples. Angkor Wat is the largest, but there are another half dozen that are at least 3/4 that size. So there are all of these state temples because each time a new ruler came to power, he created one or sometimes two or sometimes more state temples dedicated to his ancestors. So what we have is this palimpsest, and visitors today can go and visit the Angkor Park. And so they'll drive from place to place and visit big temple after big temple after big temple. So when we think of Angkor as archaeologists, we think of it as a state, or as a kingdom, or as an empire. But when tourists think of Angkor, they think of that one temple, and they're often very surprised to get to the park and find out, yes, there is Angkor Wat, but you can just drive around the corner and you'll get to the Bayon, and you can go farther and you get to Banteay Kadai, and then you can go to Ta Prohm, and then you can go to Preah Khan. It just goes on. There are many, many large temples.
So you'd sent me some materials prior to our interview that we're doing, talking about areas of contested ownership. Particularly, there's a case in one of the articles that you sent me about a contested archaeological site between Cambodia and Thailand. Can you talk a little bit about this idea of archaeology as being political? And also, how do organizations like UNESCO address and engage with politically sensitive archaeological areas such as this one?
First point, you were alluding to the Preah Vihear temple. That would be the Khmer or Cambodian label for it, or Preah Vihear, which is what the Thais call it. And it sits directly on the contemporary boundary between Cambodia and Thailand. That boundary has changed a lot in the last 150 years. The French and the English worked with the Thais to change boundaries so that Cambodia could get that area back. It had been taken away from Cambodia at some point in the 19th century. So Preah Vihear itself is a temple that's very important. It's an Angkorian period temple. We think it's, I think, an 11th, 12th century temple. But since the early 1960s, there were efforts to give it World Heritage status. World Heritage status is granted by UNESCO, which is a United Nations organization. So it is, in principle, a collective decision that's made by the international community to recognize the global importance in heritage of a particular place. We have temples, we have forests, we have all kinds, and we even have intangible heritage, dance traditions, and so on. So UNESCO's role is to give it that kind of stamp. And in order to do that, the country needs to demonstrate its value. If it gets that stamp, sometimes the country can then use that stamp, that status, in order to draw tourism and to draw funding. But it also has constraints, and it also can draw political attention. So in the case of Preah Vihear, when finally it received UNESCO World Heritage status, that really angered the Thais, because part of the temple today is in Thailand. And so the Thais said it was their temple, and the Cambodians said it was their temple. And the situation really escalated back in the mid-2000s to the point where there were literally Thai and Cambodian military up there. There were some fatalities, actually. There was a bit of fighting, and it can be a real problem. And UNESCO has an important role to play in recognizing World Heritage, but it has very little ability to protect sites. As an example, which might seem more relevant to people listening today than Cambodia, you can think about the recent Taliban takeover of Afghanistan. And we may remember back in the 90s that for some of us anyway, a great tragedy beyond the human cost was that the Taliban decided to blow up the Bamiyan Buddhas, giant Buddha images that were UNESCO World Heritage Sites precisely because there's nothing like them in the world. And they were part of this Silk Road system in the first millennium CE that crossed most of Eurasia, right? So the Taliban blew them up because Buddhas run counter to fundamental Islamic notions of representation. And there was nothing UNESCO could do about it, right? So UNESCO can have a role in promoting heritage, which is very useful. And in Cambodia, UNESCO has almost a micromanagement role at Angkor because there are twice annual meetings by this council to advise the Cambodians on how to manage their park. But they don't necessarily bring money with them. They have to channel money from different countries, and they can't bring protection. So it's a very important part of heritage management in the world, but you can't look to UNESCO for solutions to all your country's troubles.
So one of my interests in reaching out to you is that if anyone were to look at my podcast catalog, they would see that most of the people who I've interviewed are people who deal with modern history. But what I appreciate about your research is that you're one of what is, I feel, unfortunately, a declining population of people who study the pre-modern world. And you've mentioned that part of your work deals with training the next generation of archaeologists. And so I was thinking about the funding cuts to universities that have been caused by the pandemic, particularly to the humanities, which I feel tends to be seen as sometimes less important than the sciences. And with that being said, what in your view would be the strongest argument for encouraging people to study archaeology?
So I want to begin by saying that STEM fields are intrinsic to our world too. And by saying that you can study the humanities and not have to pursue a career in them. Archaeology straddles the humanities and social sciences. But I will say that most students I train who go on in archaeology do not go on in academia either. They go on in the practicing sector. But we have this problem, at least in North America, that history and the humanities are becoming less popular, and yet they're really important to think with. I think it's good for your soul. I had an undergraduate advisor once who made me take an art history class who said, your soul will be enriched. And that's kind of the role we have of humanities, right? So humanities helps us understand the richness of our past, understand the variety of cultures around us. It makes us stop and think about big questions. And we need people to build good bridges. Maybe we need to go into outer space, but we definitely need good road systems, and we definitely need to have infrastructure that works, even at the information technology level. But all of that without having humanities is kind of soulless. And so we really need humanities. I would encourage students, even those who are taking engineering, which is a very good field, to take a few classes across the humanities, history and language and art, just because humans have always been remarkable, and also because at least in the past, when we study even ancient engineering projects, we can't ever disarticulate the art from the science, right? So we have these ancient bridges, just as one example, and they're very beautiful. And we have these temples, and they're adorned with decorations, but they're built based on engineering principles. So we can't pull those apart. And in fact, archaeologists in particular love to work with engineers and model the hydraulics of canal-based irrigation and how hard it would be and how many people it would take to build big temples. So we see much more of an interdisciplinary approach. And I think that you can only have that if people attend to the humanities side. So it's good to think with, and it's important. Also, I think for understanding that as catastrophic as today seems to a lot of people, and I would imagine, especially to students today, it would seem like the world's falling apart. But if you look at the longue durée of history, you can see that really our history is one of collapse and regeneration. So I'm not the most optimistic person out there, but I do think that you have to take that long perspective. And having a humanities background gives you a little bit of faith in them.
As an extension of what we're talking about, like I've mentioned before, I have a lot of graduate students who listen to my podcast, and I wanted to know from your point of view, do you have an optimistic view of the state of humanities in universities as we exit the pandemic?
I have an optimistic view, but only if you broaden your definition of what constitutes a successful career with humanities training. Obviously, academia has been shrinking for decades, and getting a PhD does not guarantee you an academic job. And in fact, if you talk to academics, you'll find that the quality of life has been decreasing for the last several decades as well. We're asked to do more with less and teach more and do more administration and run our own grants. But I know from archaeology that the vast majority of students who graduate with a PhD in archaeology go into the practicing sector, and many of them have a much higher quality of life. They get paid better and they like what they do. So I think the first step is to think broadly, you know, what is it I love to study, but how can I move into this professional world with that knowledge and apply it in different areas? Now that might sound weaselly to say, but I think it's honest, right? So if there's a history position advertised in the university, there might be 300 applicants. It's pretty hard to distinguish yourself among such a large group. But if you think about different directions you can take that history PhD that still rely on your expertise in history, I think it's a more productive way to move forward. So I think it's still worth it for people to get graduate degrees. And I absolutely think that undergrads in all fields should be taking humanities. But you have to really think about what you're going to do with it, and you have to be very limber.
So you've obviously spent a lot of time working in the field of archaeology / anthropology. And I'm sure during that time, you've seen a lot of different ways that archaeology has been messaged to attract people to the field. In your view, what would be some of the ways in which the humanities can improve the way that it's currently advertising itself to the general public, and how can it better encourage people to join the field?
So the mantra for a long time has been digital humanities, digital humanities. And we didn't really pay attention the way we should have before. So definitely we need to create more effective messages. Certainly it's helpful when the popular culture embraces some humanities. If there's a main character, protagonist in a popular movie who's a historian or archaeologist, it gives us a little bump, right? But I think that there are more effective ways to reach people. So in digital means, we're getting much better at trying to engage the public, both visually and experientially. So visually, we need to have more appealing ways for people to learn about places, right? Whether it's just ArcGIS story maps, whether it's reconstructions like Digital Encore. But then we need to go to that next step, which museums people are starting to do with immersive 3D experiences where people can walk into the past, or people who incorporate archaeological material into online gaming. That's also important. So one direction to take this is digitally. And I think regular old documentaries don't engage most of my students unless they're 3 or 4 minute sound bites, although I make them watch them sometimes. But I also think that we can find better ways to make comic books about archaeology. And one of the most effective ways to engage the public is just to get out there. So when we do archaeology in descendant communities, we talk to people. We don't do enough of it, but we're increasing our community engagement. In the Western world, particularly in Europe and to some degree in the United States, people like to go to archaeological sites, or they like to participate in archaeological experiences. Wildly popular in England and Europe. There are people in Germany who dress in animal skins and use bows and arrows and, you know, cook over wood fires for the weekend. That's not so typical in the US. However, we do have some really wonderful experiential learning opportunities places like Crow Canyon. So we need to up our game. And I think one problem has been that for a long time, archaeologists viewed themselves as scientists whose goal was to talk to other scientists, not to the public. And we're starting to learn now that we have a lot of publics. One other point that's been very helpful, particularly in the United States, is that we don't really dig up dead civilizations, right? So that people who work in Native North America now are being held accountable by descendant communities. And that's a great thing, right? We can't talk about people as if they're gone because their great, great, great grandkids are around. And taking that same logic to other parts of the world, I think, is important. So archaeology will mean different things to different people. Certainly in Southeast Asia, where I work, it has a real resonance because Angkor is integral to Cambodian sense of nationalism. And to the point where there have been, in fact, international conflicts in the last 20 years over ownership of archaeological sites that are World Heritage sites. So it can be a point of some international contestation, but it can also be, archaeology can also be a source of great heritage pride.
Historians obviously have a relationship with museums, but I would argue that archaeologists and museums are a little more closely linked. Do you think museums can still play a meaningful role in the immersive aspect of reaching out to people? And of course, I know that museums have a somewhat problematic standing among some people in the humanities. So my question is, what are your thoughts on museums' ability to create that immersive experience for the general public?
They're integral to it. Museums have a checkered reputation. You kind of alluded to that, especially in terms of objects. They started as curiosity cabinets a lot in Europe. Very different history in Southeast Asia, where antiquities would be brought to Buddhist pagodas, which were the cultural centers of communities. But museums have also been the most responsive, I think, to the need to engage with the public. So I think they're absolutely critical. The concern is that museums conventionally, until maybe 30 years ago, even to some extent now, they really appeal, at least in the United States, to an educated upper middle class public. Hard for other people to gain access. And at the same time, museums have recognized that. I had a postdoc at the Smithsonian Museum a long time ago, but Smithsonian has been really perhaps a leader in this way in saying, look, we have some art galleries and you can go look at our postage stamps or whatever at our postal museum. But we also have the Museum of the American Indian, which we built in direct collaboration with different tribes. And we also have the Museum of African Americans, which we also did in a collaborative way. So they're setting a very high standard and trying to find a way to reach more people. Yeah, museums are very important. But I also think that the built museum is probably less important now than ever. And we need to have notions of virtual museums. We need to have mobile museums. We need to have ways to reach people. Even in pretty poor countries, developing countries, people have mobile phones. We need to be able to bring museums to them through their phones and bring them history and heritage through their phones. That's it's a big, tall order, but I think that's where we're headed.
So before we finish, one question that I like to ask all my podcast guests is, if someone's listening to this podcast episode and they're interested in knowing more about Cambodia, and one of the things I appreciate about having you on the podcast is you study an area of Asia that's not thought about as frequently as the Northeast Asian countries like China, Japan, Korea. What would be some of the books that you would recommend people read about Cambodian archaeology or Cambodian history?
I want to start by saying Northeast Asia is phenomenal, right? So if one studies Cambodia, someone like me, I have a tremendous amount of respect for the whole region. And in fact, to understand Cambodia, I have to understand China, Japan, and Korea. As just one example, which I like lately, China had diplomatic relationships with Cambodia from the 3rd century CE onward. And we have Chinese accounts, in fact, of visiting the kingdoms that were in Cambodia, one in particular. So you can't disarticulate them. In the 1600s, Japan was heading into its shogunate, and they had this tremendous need for deer skins so that all the samurai warriors could wear their uniforms, which had deer skins. And they ran out of deer skins in Japan. And then they went to Taiwan, which you're probably familiar with. And they must have run out of deer skins in Taiwan because they headed into Southeast Asia. And so Cambodia and Thailand became these major export centers for deer skins that then went up to Japan, to the Tokugawa shogunate. So you can't really just articulate them. But if you want to look at Cambodia as a country, there are two books that I would recommend. They're not entirely new. One is more recent, but they're highly accessible and really useful. The first one, and I think everyone who works in Cambodia has read some edition of this, is A History of Cambodia by David Chandler. The most recent edition, I think, was the fourth edition, which is 2007. And David Chandler, I think, has not written another edition, but it's a very lucid, clearly written explanation of 2,000 years of history. And that's hard to do in one little book. If you care about Angkor, and you want to learn about Angkor, the best, very dense book to recommend would be a book by Michael Coe and Damien Evans. And the most recent edition is from 2018. It's called Angkor and the Khmer Civilization. Those two books are very helpful in learning about Cambodia. That being said, there are innumerable documentaries out there, but there's one open access documentary. You can find it on YouTube. I like it, and not only because I was in it, that was fun, but because it's very recent and it has a kind of cultural sensitivity, which maybe reflects the fact that someone from Singapore made it. It's called Cambodia's Temple Kingdom, the Mark of Empire, Angkor. And it's a really lovely 45-minute romp through the Angkorian Empire, which includes the narrator trying to learn how to dance like apsaras to try to understand more of the Khmer culture. So it's factual and it's useful. I think there are a lot of other ways people can learn also about Cambodia. There is this virtual Angkor webpage that Monash University runs, really important and really good. Tom Chandler, who is David Chandler's son, has been working with other colleagues for 20 years now to try to make 3D reconstructions of what life would have been like in Angkor. And he works very closely with us archaeologists, and he works very closely with historians to do that. So I'm recommending two books, one by David Chandler, History of Cambodia, one by Michael Coe and Damien Evans, Angkor and the Khmer Civilization, one documentary, Cambodia's Temple Kingdom, the Mark of Empire, and then this virtual Angkor website, which you can Google. Those are different ways to access Cambodia very easily. I hope that your readers could go further than that soon. We're down to a 1-week quarantine in Cambodia, but I hope they can go. There's nothing like visiting Cambodia. The Khmers are extraordinary hosts, and it's a beautiful country. And I think that that's the true best access route to understanding Cambodia and its history, is to go there and to be able to walk among the temples and to talk to people.
Dr. Stark, thanks for coming on this episode of the What is Asia podcast.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
And for those who want to see more content, you can go to the What is Asia podcast YouTube channel or nakotadefonso.com. We'll see you in the next episode.